And thanks to at home for joining us this hour. There's a lot going on tonight, lots to cover. Very glad you're here with us. We've got a dynamite former U.S. attorney who's here tonight to help us understand why the FBI raided the Trump campaign chairman's house in the middle of the night. We've got Andrea Mitchell with us here tonight for the latest on the North Korea situation and for the latest on this other truly strange story that kind of halfway broke tonight about U.S. diplomats in one particular country allegedly being targeted in that country with secret devices that were designed to make them go deaf. I'm not kidding. It is the weirdest story I have heard in a very long time. It almost made me wish like we still had a State Department back in Washington who could answer questions about it. That's ahead tonight. Plus, we've got a multiple Pulitzer Prize winning reporter from the Washington Post here with us tonight to walk us through the Post's latest scoop on the Russia investigation. So there's lots to come tonight. I want to start, though, with one of the biggest and most successful corruption prosecutions we have ever had in the modern era in this country. It started in 1994, on Election Day 1994. When a big family from Chicago, a family called the Willis family, was driving down the highway in their van. They were from the south side of Chicago. They were driving actually in Wisconsin near Milwaukee. 6 kids and 2 parents in their van rolling down the interstate when a truck in front of them started shedding its parts. Now, apparently, other drivers on the highway had seen that this truck was having trouble. They had seen that that there was stuff hanging off of this truck. They saw how dangerous it was. Other drivers had tried to signal to the driver of the truck to let him know something was wrong, but the truck driver didn't respond appropriately, didn't really seem to do anything in response to these alerts from other drivers. Ultimately, a piece of his taillight assembly fell off his truck at speed on the highway, and it bounced on the road, and it bounced underneath the van that was carrying the Willis family, and that piece of that truck became shrapnel, and it punctured the gas tank of the van, and the van went up in a fireball. 5 of the 6 kids were killed instantly in the fireball. The 6th child, who was the eldest, and he was only 13, he died hours later. He died the next day. The parents were severely burned, but they survived. Just an unbelievable tragedy. Happened on Election Day 1994. And that unbelievable tragedy ultimately turned into one of the biggest corruption prosecutions in modern U.S. history. And it took a dozen years to get to the end of it. It took years to figure out. It took years to unwind it all. But it turned out that that truck driver on that highway outside Milwaukee never should have been licensed to drive that truck. In fact, he wasn't really licensed to drive that truck. The way he got his commercial driver's license was that he paid a bribe for it. The corruption scandal that state investigators and then federal prosecutors and the FBI ultimately unraveled turned out to be a thorough and ongoing scheme to sell commercial driver's licenses for a price, to sell licenses of all kinds, to sell permits, to sell leases, to sell contracts, to sell all sorts of things that the state government did in exchange for bribes. And the elected officials who oversaw that bribery scheme saw to it that the bribe money didn't just go into public officials' pockets, it also specifically went into their campaign funds to make sure they'd be able to stay in office so they could keep overseeing this corrupt system where all that bribery money went into their pockets, and the people who paid were people who happened to be on the motorway with people who got their commercial driver's licenses by greasing somebody's palm instead of by being qualified to have them. And by the time prosecutors finally nailed down that scheme, more than 75 state officials got indicted and convicted. No one who was indicted and put on trial was found not guilty. They just nailed them, more than 75 of them. And by the time it was really over, the guy who they had in the dock was the very top guy in the state government, was the governor of the state, a guy named George Ryan. George Ryan was a Republican. He wasn't actually perceived as a terrible governor in Illinois, but he was right at the center of that absolutely corrosive corruption scandal. That election day back in 1994, when the Willis family lost 6 kids on that highway, That day, that election day, George Ryan had just been reelected to the Secretary of State's office in Illinois, which was in charge of issuing things like commercial driver's licenses. After that tragedy, an internal review found that the truck driver in the Willis family crash should not have been licensed, and in fact, he probably paid a bribe to get his commercial license. When that internal investigation came up with that finding, good old George Ryan and the Secretary of State's office shut down that internal state investigation, and he fired the investigators. It's harder to get these things done when people are shutting it down along the way. But a good investigation team, good prosecutors, good law enforcement doesn't stop. It ultimately took years of investigators and years of all the corrupt politicians trying to cover it up. It took more than 75 indictments and convictions of state employees, but by the end of it, they got him. They got George Ryan, who by the time they got him had risen to become governor of the state. They got him on bribery, obstruction of justice, lying to investigators, extortion, money laundering, tax fraud. They got him on racketeering, orchestration and involvement in an ongoing criminal enterprise, which under him was a significant portion of the government of the state of Illinois, which was being run as a criminal enterprise. That's how you get the governor on a RICO case. And that scandal pops in modern American history and will continue to pop in American history for a long time. For a few different reasons. I mean, first and most obviously, it is a textbook case of how corruption works and how in America, when things work the way they should, you cannot use corruption to build up so much political power that you can outrun or outlast a good criminal investigation of your behavior. If you did it, if you left evidence of your crimes, there is no get-out-of-jail-free card no matter how high you rise in politics. Good investigators, a good prosecution will catch you, no matter how long it takes and no matter how high you rise and no matter who you are. That is one reason that case sticks with us still, a decade after Governor George Ryan got sent to prison. The Governor George Ryan case also sticks with us because it's Illinois. It's like a punchline corruption case. Even before George Ryan was done serving his prison sentence for corruption, he was joined by the next governor of Illinois, Rod Blagojevich, who was also sentenced to federal prison for corruption. 4 of the last 7 governors of Illinois have gone to prison. So that's another reason why that case sticks with us. But there is now one more reason that case is likely to stick with us for at least a while longer. And it's because of a small piece of that dramatic trial for Governor George Ryan, a small piece of that trial, which was controversial at the time, is now back. You might recognize the federal prosecutor who brought the corruption case against Governor George Ryan. The prosecutor's name was Patrick Fitzgerald. You might remember him from the George W. Bush years. He played a very high-profile role in the Scooter Libby Valerie Plame case in the George W. Bush administration. That's the case where Dick Cheney's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, was convicted of lying to federal investigators and obstructing justice. Patrick Fitzgerald was the special counsel in that case. He was also the U.S. attorney, the federal prosecutor in Chicago, and he led the prosecution of Governor George Ryan. And in the middle of that prosecution, one very strange thing happened, at least strange from the perspective of federal law enforcement. So in this case, right, they're trying the governor in this huge corruption case, this huge, deadly, years-long corruption case. And there's Patrick Fitzgerald, U.S. attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, right, based in Chicago, and he's prosecuting this case against the governor of the state. And at that trial, another serving federal prosecutor from the same state, the U.S. attorney from the Southern District in Illinois, came into that trial and testified for the defense, came in and testified for the governor. That's a very strange thing. I mean, and it was seen as a very strange thing at the time. Even a decade later, it is still seen as a strange thing. Christian Berthelsen and Matt Robinson wrote about this recently for Bloomberg News. They described it as a, quote, a bizarre spectacle. I mean, it's a weird thing. One of the U.S. attorneys in Illinois coming in and testifying, in effect, against one of the other U.S. attorneys in Illinois, criticizing his office, criticizing the prosecution, standing up for the defense against his fellow prosecutors. It was a weird thing. The prosecutor who did that is a man named Edward McNally. And it was controversial at the time, not just because this was a weird thing to do, to have a federal prosecutor on one side and a federal prosecutor on the other side, too. It was controversial for months thereafter because it soon emerged that the law firm defending the governor, right, the law firm defending the governor, who scored this huge coup by having a sitting federal prosecutor come in and testify on their side of the case, turns out that that law firm was also involved in another matter at the same time, where they were the law firm that was trying to recover debt that a bunch of Chicago lawyers, a bunch of Illinois lawyers owed when their law firm had gone bankrupt. One of the lawyers, it turns out, who they were trying to collect a six-figure debt from was Edward McNally. While they're pursuing him for that six-figure debt, he comes into this trial and pays that law firm this remarkable favor of sitting down on the other side of another federal prosecutor on behalf of the defense while he's serving as a federal U.S. attorney. They're after him for money. And he comes in and does them this favor. When the prosecution side, the Pat Fitzgerald side, figured it out, they went nuts. They even found an email in which the guy's own lawyers had written to the firm defending Governor Ryan saying, hey, they should cut Edward McNally some slack. They should give him some extra time to pay off his debt. In part because, look, he came in and testified for the defense to help their client, the governor. So that weird part of that trial, one prosecutor facing off against the other prosecutor from the same state, these two U.S. attorneys on either side of the case. It was a weird offshoot of a big, important corruption case that continues to resonate years later for all sorts of reasons. When that part of it came out about this federal prosecutor testifying for the defense, the two senators from Illinois at the time, Dick Durbin, who's still a senator, and a then senator named Barack Obama, they asked the Justice Department to review the whole thing for potential misconduct. And the Bush-era Justice Department did investigate it. They cleared McNally and decided nobody did anything wrong. A decade later now, the whole thing is still remembered as a bizarre spectacle. But Edward McNally has absolutely landed on his feet. He's now a partner in this guy's law firm. He's a partner in Mark Kazowitz's law firm. Mark Kazowitz might still be the president's lead lawyer on the Russia investigation. Might not. Hard to tell at this point. Mark Kazowitz and his firm have represented Donald Trump and the Trump Organization for years on everything from the multi-million-dollar fraud case that Trump lost about Trump University to Trump's efforts to keep his divorce records out of the public eye to the pseudo-legal threats to sue or register complaints against everybody from the New York Times to FBI Director James Comey to women accusing Donald Trump of sexual harassment. They maybe are even representing the president in the ongoing issues related to the Russia investigation. Edward McNally is a partner in Mark Kazowitz's firm, and the White House has now reportedly forwarded Edward McNally's name as one of their top candidates to be the new U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. The Eastern District of New York, it's based in Brooklyn. It's one of the highest profile law enforcement districts in the country. They are known in particular for their vociferous prosecutions, their relentless prosecution of organized crime, racketeering, money laundering, things like that. The White House has named the George Ryan corruption trial guy, who is Mark Kazowitz's law partner, as one of their potential nominees for the Eastern District of New York. And for the Southern District of New York, which is even more high profile, it's the epicenter of financial crime prosecution in this whole country. And it happens to include, as part of its jurisdiction, the place that Trump Tower is, where the Trump Organization is headquartered. For the Southern District of New York, they've just reportedly forwarded the name of a different lawyer, Jeffrey Berman, who's a law partner of one of Donald Trump's best friends in the world, Rudolph Giuliani. So if, hypothetically, President Trump has any concerns about potential federal liability related to his family business or his past or current business practices, the president obviously will have in mind the special counsel investigation on Russia, led by former FBI Director Robert Mueller, but he will also probably have in mind these two crucial, high-profile New York jurisdictions. So having those prosecutors' offices headed up by a guy from Mark Kazowitz's law firm and a guy by Rudy Giuliani's law firm, I mean, if you were worried, hypothetically, that would probably feel like a cold compress on a fevered brow, right, for this beleaguered White House. Rudy, you got anybody for Southern District? Mark, you got anybody for Eastern District? I mean, if Congress lets them do it, right? These are Senate-confirmed positions. And in a general sense, it's true that it's the U.S. Justice Department that, as a body, that oversees all federal law enforcement matters and prosecutions in the United States, right? The Justice Department does federal law enforcement. That's why it was weird to have two Justice Department federal prosecutors working opposite sides of the same case back in the Governor George Ryan corruption scandal. But within that overall umbrella of the Justice Department, individual personnel matters. Who an individual prosecutor is, how an individual prosecutor works, it can change the course of justice. It can change lives. It can change history. In terms of the day-to-day way they do their work, a federal prosecutor works hand in glove with a grand jury. Grand juries are regular citizens who are called up for what's basically like normal jury duty on steroids. You get called up for jury duty. Usually you sit for a single trial. If you're on a grand jury, you don't just sit for a single trial. You sit for anywhere from a month to a year, usually for several months. And under the direction of the prosecutor, the grand jury makes decisions about whether criminal charges can be brought in federal cases. And in the course of making that decision, the grand jury has a lot of power. They can pursue evidence. Prosecutors have grand juries sign off on subpoenas to go get evidence or to compel testimony or to compel the production of documents. It's a very powerful, can be very intimidating part of our justice system. In the case of the Trump-Russia investigation, we started hearing about grand juries issuing subpoenas to people related to the Trump campaign and related to the Trump administration back in May. We were first to report here on this show on May 11th that the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, was refusing to say whether or not he was recused from overseeing any Justice Department investigations that might relate to Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort. By later on that month, by a week later, in fact, by May 17th, the New York Times and NBC News had reported that that was not a hypothetical question. That grand juries were at work with federal prosecutors on investigations related to both Trump National Security Advisor Mike Flynn and Paul Manafort. That was in May. By the first week of June, it was reported that whatever prosecutors and grand juries had been working on Flynn and Manafort investigations, whichever grand juries and prosecutors had been issuing subpoenas in those investigations, both of them were being taken out of the normal course of Justice Department oversight. Both Flynn investigations and Manafort investigations were being taken over by the special counsel, Bob Mueller. By the end of June, June 30th, we learned that among the prosecutors and lawyers who Bob Mueller has been bringing on to his team at the special counsel's office, one of the lawyers he brought on is the prosecutor who was leading the Paul Manafort investigation in the Southern District of New York, before that prosecution got subsumed into Mueller's work. So, in parallel with all of that attention and action from federal prosecutors and grand juries and the special counsel's office, we also know that Paul Manafort was dealing simultaneously with another group of people who had subpoena power and who were interested in him. And those were the congressional committees investigating the Trump-Russia issue. Paul Manafort was initially scheduled to testify on Tuesday, July 25th, to the Intelligence Committee in the Senate. He was then scheduled to testify the following day, Wednesday, July 26th, to the Judiciary Committee in the Senate. And some of that planned testimony was in response to requests from those committees. Some of that was in response to subpoenas from those committees. Like grand juries, investigative committees in the Congress can issue subpoenas. And so, remember, by this point, by late last month, we know that Paul Manafort is not just dealing with subpoenas and demands from Congress, he's also dealing with subpoenas from federal prosecutors and grand juries, and he's been dealing with those for months. And that's all been happening simultaneously, all the way through May and June and into late July. But now we know that something very different happened 2 weeks ago in late July. Thanks to the Washington Post today, reporting by Carol Leonnig, Tom Hamburger, and Rosalind Helderman, we now know that for some reason, after midnight on the night of the 25th, the morning of the 26th, so the night after he testified to the Intelligence Committee and the morning before he was initially scheduled to talk to the Judiciary Committee, for some reason, in the pre-dawn hours, The federal prosecutors and grand juries that have brought this thing this far decided that they would go another step and start doing this in a different way. When the FBI raided Paul Manafort's house in Virginia in the wee hours of July 26th, ABC reports tonight he was awoken by a group of armed FBI agents knocking on his bedroom door. When those armed agents raided his house, they weren't just working off the word of a federal prosecutor and a grand jury who can act on their own steam, who have been powering this investigation and everything we have learned about it up until this point for months. No, for there to have been a raid by armed FBI agents, that means they were serving a search warrant, which means that Bob Mueller and his team had filed a sworn affidavit with a judge that spelled out probable cause that a specific crime or crimes had been committed, and also spelling out probable cause that evidence related to those potential crimes would be found at the specific location named in the warrant, which was Paul Manafort's house. And presented with that affidavit, the judge signed off, which means we are in a new phase here. This is the first time we know that the investigators have presented and persuaded a judge of probable cause that crimes have been committed in the matters under investigation. So, here's my questions. One, why did they stop seeking information from him by subpoena? Why did they instead move on to raiding his house and taking things under a search warrant? Did the subpoena process stop working? Also, as far as I understand it, Justice Department guidelines require agents to pursue evidence by the least obtrusive means possible. Sending armed agents to his bedroom door in the middle of the night is not the least obtrusive means possible. Do they have to explain why they did it this way? What all the urgency was about? Do we ever get to see the search warrant or the affidavit that led to it that spelled out the alleged crimes here and the evidence they were looking for? Did the timing of this raid have anything to do with the fact that Paul Manafort, less than 24 hours earlier, had done an interview with the Senate Intelligence Committee? If so, what's the connection between those two things? Would the FBI have known the content of what Manafort said to the Intelligence Committee that morning, if that is what sparked the raid? Also, because I'm nosy, how did Paul Manafort's house get raided at 3 in the morning or whatever, and none of his neighbors leaked word to anyone for 2 whole weeks? I mean, it's not the most important part of this, I know, but it kind of puts a whole new spin on neighborhood watch, right? Neighborhood, oh my God, watch, it's Paul Manafort, don't tell anyone. So there's a lot going on here. Some of these questions have answers we ought to be able to get in the public domain, and we're going to try to get some of them this hour. Some of these questions I don't think we'll know answers to for a long time. I should also tell you the story continues to develop tonight. Politico reporting tonight that federal investigators have approached Paul Manafort's son-in-law about cooperating in the investigation and what Politico describes as an effort to increase pressure on Paul Manafort. Federal law enforcement is powerful. It matters who holds the reins of power within that system. Federal law enforcement has a logic that is interesting to untangle and follow when it is unraveling dramatic wrongdoing. But covering federal law enforcement actions very rarely seems weird, right? Very rarely takes a bizarre turn nobody was seeing. When it does, it tends to resonate for not just months, but for years. It tends to resonate into history. And rarely since the start of this scandal have we watched a federal law enforcement action that has immediately provoked not just conclusions, but tons of burning questions. And that's why we're very lucky tonight to have Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter Carol Leonnig with us from the Washington Post. She broke this FBI raid story today. We'll be with her next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.